My name is Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The morning light lay softly across the village of St. Mary Mead, filtering through curtains of lace and landing in quiet pools on polished tables, gleaming teacups, and the patient face of a woman who had learned long ago that life's smallest tremors often hid the greatest truths. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, knitting needles glinting faintly, though her attention was scarcely on the soft blue wool between them. She was watching the street without appearing to watch, of course, and noting how much her beloved village had changed since last she took a proper walk along its lanes. The war, and what had followed, had done peculiar things to English villages. Where once there were meadow paths and hedgerows bursting with wildflowers, there now stood rows of new houses, all nearly identical, cheerful in a rather modern way, but robbed of the individuality that old cottages possessed. Miss Marple had made her peace with change in theory. In practice, she regarded it with mild suspicion. Her ankle, twisted some weeks earlier when she misjudged a step in the garden, kept her indoors more than she liked. Mrs. Knight, the brisk new housekeeper the doctor had insisted upon, ruled the household with a competence Miss Marple found both admirable and faintly oppressive. Mrs. Knight did not approve of old ladies gallivanting, as she called it, and so Miss Marple's days were spent in quiet observation, her sharp mind compensating for what her body could not presently do. Outside, a motor car passed, one of the new small models that made a high, almost eager sound, and a boy on a bicycle pedaled furiously behind it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Life went on, endlessly varied, endlessly revealing if one only took the trouble to look. The sound of footsteps approached, and a familiar voice followed the gentle tap on the door. "Come in, Dolly," Miss Marple called, already recognizing the brisk, energetic pattern of her friend's walk. Mrs. Dolly Bantry entered as if propelled by a cheerful gust of wind. She was stout, bright-eyed, and dressed in a shade of green that suggested both confidence and a willingness to be noticed. "My dear Jane," she began, removing her gloves with an air of excitement, "you will never guess what's happened now." Miss Marple laid down her knitting, the faintest smile touching her lips. "In my experience, Dolly, when you say that, it usually involves something dramatic and more often than not, someone from outside the village." Mrs. Bantry gave a delighted laugh. "Quite right. Outside the village, but very much in it now, if you please. Gossington Hall has been sold." That gave Miss Marple pause. "Gossington Hall?" she repeated softly. "Why, Dolly, I thought you'd never part with it." Mrs. Bantry sighed, a sound half regretful and half resigned. "One must be practical, dear Jane. It's far too large for just Arthur and me. We've moved to a perfectly nice smaller place on the high street, and anyway, the new owners are most exciting." Miss Marple raised an inquisitive brow. "Exciting?" "Marina Gregg," Mrs. Bantry announced with the relish of one who unveils a surprise. "The film star. And her husband, what's his name, Jason Rudd, imagine. Gossington Hall full of film people." Miss Marple's blue eyes brightened. "Indeed. How extraordinary. Oh, quite. She intends to live quietly here, or so the papers say. I must say she looked beautiful in the photograph, though a bit tragic perhaps. You know that look some of them have, glamorous, but as if they've seen too much." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Fame can be a lonely sort of success," Mrs. Bantry laughed. "Jane, you sound as if you know all about it." "One doesn't need to be famous to observe the effects of notoriety," Miss Marple replied gently. "The village may find her fascinating, but I suspect she will find the village equally so." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "She's already planning a charity fete at the hall next month, an open invitation. It's to raise funds for the local hospital, and everyone's simply thrilled. You must come." Miss Marple gave a rueful glance toward her bandaged ankle. "Alas, my ankle may prevent me. But you, my dear, must tell me everything." "You can depend on that," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "I shall take notes if necessary." The two women laughed, the comfortable sound of friendship long established. Yet as Dolly chattered on about the decor of the hall, the new furnishings, the curious mix of Hollywood style and English tradition, Miss Marple found her thoughts drifting. She had seen many newcomers to St. Mary Mead over the years. Some adapted, some did not. There was always something revealing in how a person met the rhythms of a village, whether with humility or with condescension. Time, she thought, would tell which sort of woman Marina Gregg proved to be. When Mrs. Bantry finally departed, Miss Marple sat for a long while by the window. Outside, the church clock chimed noon. She could see the rooftops of the new development beyond the trees, a place the locals already called the development with capital letters, as if it were a foreign province. People from London had moved there, people who did not know the unspoken rules of village life. They meant no harm, of course, but their ignorance could sometimes prove unfortunate. Her musings were interrupted by Mrs. Knight entering with the midday tray. The woman placed it down with an efficiency bordering on severity. "You shouldn't tire yourself, ma'am," she said. "Best to rest that ankle." "Thank you, Mrs. Knight," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I was only thinking." "Thinking never did any good without doing," Mrs. Knight said, and departed in a rustle of starch and disapproval. Left alone, Miss Marple smiled faintly. She had long ago learned that for her, thinking was the most useful form of doing. That evening, as dusk deepened and lamps glowed behind drawn curtains, a car stopped briefly outside her gate. Miss Marple, ever alert to small happenings, noted it at once. The driver leaned to check an address, then moved on toward Gossington Hall. She caught a glimpse. A pale face framed by dark hair, the glimmer of jewels even in the fading light. A woman who looked not unlike the photographs she had seen in the paper, so Marina Gregg had arrived. The following days brought a new liveliness to the village. Workmen came and went from the hall. Vans delivered crates of flowers, paintings, and draperies. Rumors ran swift as sparrows. Mrs. Price Ridley reported that the actress was delicate and would keep mostly to herself. Mr. Tappet, the butcher, claimed she had ordered only lean meat, like them foreign types. And the ladies at the Women's Institute debated whether to invite her to speak at their next gathering, though none could quite decide on what topic. Miss Marple listened, smiled, and said little. She knew how quickly admiration could turn to resentment if the admired failed to conform. For now the village basked in the novelty of having a real celebrity among them. It would not last. The morning mist lifted lazily from the hedgerows as the village prepared itself for an event that had set all tongues wagging for weeks. The fête at Gossington Hall was to be unlike any St. Mary Mead had seen before. So the invitations proclaimed, and so the villagers believed. For some it was a chance to glimpse celebrity, for others a matter of civic pride. For Miss Marple, confined by her troublesome ankle and forced to observe from afar, it was simply another opportunity to study human nature in its endlessly revealing parade. From her window she could see, across the distant fields, the faint shimmer of bunting being raised along the drive to the hall. Even at that distance, the signs of industry were unmistakable, cars coming and going, servants moving briskly across the lawns, and the faint, echoing thud of hammering as stalls were set up. She could almost smell the excitement on the air. Mrs. Knight had already commented sourly that no good ever comes of these fancy do's, but Miss Marple had smiled, as she so often did, and continued knitting. By mid-morning, the sounds of activity drifted through the village, music rehearsals, laughter, and the hum of gossip. The grocer, Mr. Hargreaves, claimed he'd seen Marina herself supervising the flower arrangements at dawn. Young women from the new estate walked into the village with a spring in their step, their hair freshly curled and dresses carefully chosen. Even the vicar's wife confessed to Dolly Bantry that she was just the tiniest bit curious to see what a real Hollywood star looked like. Miss Marple received visitors that morning, as she often did. First came old Mr. Petherick, to check on her ankle and to bring word from the church committee. He talked of funds and attendance figures, but soon enough, as all conversations in St. Mary Mead now did, he drifted to the subject of Marina Gregg. "They say she's not well," he confided, lowering his voice. "Something in her nerves. The kind of strain those acting folk get, I suppose. I dare say the quiet life here will do her good." Miss Marple nodded, the expression in her eyes thoughtful. "It might indeed, if she truly wishes for quiet." He smiled faintly. "And if the village lets her have it. But you know what people are like." "Yes," she murmured. "I do." After he left, she settled back in her chair, letting her mind wander as the clock ticked softly. Fame, she reflected, was a curious thing. It magnified virtues and flaws alike until a person's very humanity was distorted by the gaze of others. Some thrived on that attention. Others, she had seen it before, were broken by it. She wondered which sort of woman Marina Gregg might be. By afternoon, Dolly Bantry called in, flushed with the exertions of last-minute errands.
"Jane, I've come to show you my hat," she declared, sweeping off her coat.
"Tell me what you think." She placed a creation of green straw and feathers upon her head, turned in profile and added, "It's rather too daring, I fear. But one must make an effort for film stars." Miss Marple smiled. "It's charming, dear. I think you'll do St. Mary Mead great credit." Dolly sat down with the sigh of one enjoying a rare moment of leisure. "Everyone's in a flutter," she said. "There'll be photographers, apparently. Jason Rudd has arranged for the local paper to cover it, and the whole house has been transformed. Modern lighting, enormous mirrors, a sort of grand staircase that seems designed for making entrances." "Mirrors," Miss Marple said softly. "They do play tricks sometimes." Dolly looked puzzled, then laughed. "You're always so mysterious, Jane. You make me feel as though there's a moral in everything." "Not a moral," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Only patterns. Human behavior follows patterns, you know. Sometimes they're quite simple to read if one watches quietly." Dolly leaned forward. "You mustn't worry about being left out. I shall tell you every detail, every expression. You'll know as much as if you'd been there yourself." Miss Marple smiled again, grateful for the kindness and quite certain she would indeed learn all she needed to know. People rarely concealed their true natures for long, even in second-hand accounts. She had long discovered that gossip, for all its distortions, often carried a kernel of truth if one listened to the tone as well as the tale. That evening, after Dolly had gone, Miss Marple watched the sunset spread its rose and amber light over the rooftops. In the west, beyond the trees, Gossington Hall gleamed faintly, white walls catching the dying glow. A faint music drifted on the air, so soft it might have been imagined. Somewhere a car door slammed, followed by laughter. The fete, she thought, would be the beginning of something. She could feel it, a stirring of fate or perhaps of tragedy. It was a habit of hers to sense when life was about to take one of its darker turns, and the feeling was unmistakable now. The following morning broke fine and bright, the sky a clear English blue with a few slow-moving clouds that promised fair weather. From early hours, the lanes were alive with movement, families on foot, bicycles wobbling under baskets, even a few motor cars proudly polished for the occasion. Children carried paper flags, women wore their best dresses, men their Sunday suits. The fete at Gossington Hall was a social occasion of the first order. At 11 o'clock, Mrs. Knight brought Miss Marple her tea and tried, unsuccessfully, to conceal her own curiosity. "I suppose there'll be pictures of it in the paper," she said. "That actress woman, what's her name again? She'll be the centerpiece, I expect." "Marina Gregg," Miss Marple said gently. "She was very famous once." "Once?" Mrs. Knight sniffed. "I never heard of her." Miss Marple smiled. "That Mrs. Knight is the way of fame. It fades faster than people imagine." Left alone, she pictured it all, the stands with cakes and jams, the laughter, the inevitable speeches. She could almost hear Dolly's bright voice above the crowd, and the rustle of excitement as Marina appeared. Her imagination supplied the scene vividly, perhaps because she had seen so many like it before in other places, other times. Wherever people gathered for pleasure, there was always the potential for something unexpected to occur. And it was precisely in such moments of ease that the human heart revealed its secrets. At Gossington Hall, the fete had indeed begun in high spirits. The lawns, newly clipped and edged with roses, were dotted with tables and bunting. Music floated from a gramophone set near the veranda, and the scent of freshly baked scones mingled with that of lilies arranged in great urns by the entrance. Villagers moved in groups admiring the transformation of the old hall. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in her green hat, moved from stall to stall with cheerful authority. Inside, at the top of the staircase, stood Marina Gregg. She was everything the villagers had hoped for. Tall, graceful, radiant, her gown of pale blue silk catching the light like water. Her husband, Jason Rudd, remained close by, a quiet, watchful presence whose calm seemed designed to steady her. Marina greeted everyone with a warmth that surprised many. She spoke softly, smiled often, and listened intently. Yet those who looked closely, few did, might have noticed a certain fragility about her, as though each smile cost her an effort. Dolly Bantry, of course, missed nothing. "She's lovelier than I expected," she confided to the vicar's wife. "But there's something rather sad in her eyes, don't you think? As if she's watching herself from a distance." It was at that moment that Heather Badcock approached, a cheerful, plump woman from the new estate, dressed in a bright floral frock and radiating friendliness. "Mrs. Gregg," she exclaimed, beaming. "Oh, I'm so thrilled to see you. You won't remember me, of course, but I met you years ago. Oh, let me see, yes, in Bermuda it was. I was quite ill, but I simply couldn't miss seeing you when you were filming there." Her voice bubbled on, oblivious to the slight stiffening in Marina's posture. Jason, nearby, glanced at his wife, a flicker of concern crossing his face. Marina continued to smile, politely, distantly, but her expression had changed. Something had moved behind her eyes, a shadow almost imperceptible, and the hand that held her glass trembled slightly. Heather prattled on, unaware. "I was so excited. I got up out of bed when I should have stayed there. The doctor said I had measles, imagine. But I said no, I must see Marina Gregg. And you were so sweet, you gave me your autograph. Look, I still have it." The conversation drifted to others nearby, but those closest to Marina noticed her sudden stillness, the way her gaze had fixed upon Heather's face. It was as if for a brief instant she had seen something, or remembered something, that froze her blood. Then she turned slightly, her eyes falling upon the large mirror behind her, its surface catching the light from the window and reflecting the crowd in broken, shifting fragments. Her expression, Dolly would later say, became like the Lady of Shalott, seeing doom through the mirror cracked from side to side. And in that suspended moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. A burst of laughter rang somewhere across the lawn, cutting sharply through the stillness that had fallen around the top of the staircase. The band began a new tune, light and cheerful as though the world had not noticed that one corner of it had gone suddenly cold. Marina Gregg's fingers relaxed their hold on the glass. Jason reached for it, murmuring something low, but before he could take it, Heather Badcock gave a small, surprised sound, a breath half caught in her throat, and then staggered sideways. Someone laughed again, thinking she had tripped. But the sound that followed was unmistakable, the heavy thud of a body collapsing upon the polished floor. For a moment there was confusion, a scuffle of skirts and the clatter of dropped plates. Then silence fell so swiftly that even the music seemed embarrassed to continue. Heather lay motionless, her bright floral dress spread around her like the petals of a crushed flower. A glass rolled from her limp hand, spinning in a lazy circle before it shattered. Jason Rudd was the first to move. He set down Marina's untouched drink and bent over Heather, calling for help. Marina did not follow. She stood where she was, one hand resting lightly on the banister, her eyes fixed on the mirror again as though afraid to look away. Her reflection wavered in the fractured light. A voice called for a doctor. There was always one in a crowd, and the guests parted to make room. The vicar, pale but composed, ushered curious onlookers back. Dolly Bantry, recovering from the first shock, bent to assist, but a quick glance from Jason stopped her. Heather's face had already turned a peculiar shade, and her breath, if it existed, was imperceptible. Within minutes, the fate was over. The laughter, the music, the smell of tea and roses, all of it was suddenly indecent against the hush that had fallen over the hall. People moved in uncertain clusters, whispering, glancing toward the doorway where a constable had arrived from the village. The doctor's pronouncement came quickly. The woman was dead. Miss Marple, sitting by her window half a mile away, did not yet know of the tragedy, but something, an instinct refined by years of quiet observation, stirred within her. It was that same restless unease that came whenever harmony broke in the pattern of daily life. She looked toward the hall, visible through a gap in the trees. The bunting fluttered still in the afternoon breeze, gay and meaningless, and beneath it, she fancied, the faint sound of sirens began to rise. By evening, word had reached every corner of St. Mary Mead. A woman, one of the newcomers from the development, had died suddenly at Marina Gregg's fete. Some said it was her heart, others whispered poison. No one knew, but everyone speculated. The grocer swore that Heather had looked perfectly well that morning. The postmistress recalled that she had mentioned meeting Marina years ago. And Mrs. Price Ridley declared that these modern film people brought misfortune wherever they went. When Dolly Bantry came to see Miss Marple the next day, she was pale with shock but brimming with details. It was dreadful, Jane, simply dreadful. One moment she was chatting away. I could hear her quite clearly talking about how she'd once met Marina abroad, And then she was gone. Just like that. Miss Marple listened without interrupting, her needles moving rhythmically. "Tell me everything, Dolly. Slowly, if you please." "Well," Dolly began, still trembling slightly. She'd just finished telling Marina about their meeting, some nonsense about being ill and still coming out to see her, when Marina's face changed. "I saw it, Jane. It wasn't anger exactly, more as though she'd seen a ghost." She looked at the mirror behind her. Oh, that great hideous thing. And for a second she wasn't really there at all. Then Heather took the glass she'd been offered, had a sip, and the next instant she was on the floor. "The doctor said it was cyanide." "Cyanide?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "How very unpleasant. And the drink, it was intended for her or for someone else?" "That's just it." The waiter brought 2 glasses. Marina took one, then set it down. Heather took the other, but it's hard to say which was which. Everyone's arguing about it. Poor Jason looked stricken. And Marina, well, she hasn't been seen since. They say she's ill again. Miss Marple looked down at her knitting. The pattern she had been following in a simple, repetitive lace had gone astray somewhere. She did not correct it. "And this Heather Badcock, and you said she was from the new houses?" Yes. Married to Arthur Badcock. He's in insurance, I think. She was always cheerful. Talked rather too much if you ask me, but harmless." "Harmless," Miss Marple repeated, her tone thoughtful. "People often are, until they aren't." Dolly gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, Jane, you make it sound as if there's more to it." "There usually is," Miss Marple said mildly. "Tell me, did Marina drink from her glass at all?" Dolly frowned, trying to remember. "No, I don't think she did. She lifted it, yes, but then she turned to Jason and set it down again. The waiter brought another tray a moment later, but by then, of course." She trailed off, shivering slightly. "You don't think the poison was meant for Marina, do you?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "I think," she said after a pause, "that when one is very famous, one must always consider that possibility." Later, when Dolly had gone, Miss Marple sat in silence. The clock ticked, the garden stirred in the evening wind, and the smell of rain drifted faintly through the open window. Cyanide. Quick, sure, unmistakable. A poison that spoke of knowledge, not impulse. And yet something in Dolly's account troubled her more than the method. That moment when Marina's face had changed, when she'd looked into the mirror as though seeing doom itself. There was meaning there, hidden but close. The next morning brought confirmation from the papers. "Woman dies at actress's party, poison suspected." The headline was larger than Miss Marple liked. The article beneath it was thin on facts and thick with speculation, but a small paragraph near the end caught her attention. Inspector Dermot Craddock of Scotland Yard had been assigned to the case. She smiled faintly. Craddock had learned much since the days when they'd first crossed paths. He had grown less skeptical, more patient, and perhaps more inclined to listen to the advice of old ladies with sharp eyes. True to expectation, he came to see her 2 days later. The visit was half duty, half courtesy, but Miss Marple saw at once that the case disturbed him. "It's a tangle," he admitted, taking the chair she indicated. "We can't even say for certain who the intended victim was. The drink could easily have been meant for Mrs. Gregg. But then why would anyone target Heather Badcock? She seems the last person in the world to make enemies." Miss Marple poured tea. "The last people are sometimes the most likely, Inspector. They drift through life, making small, thoughtless mistakes. And sometimes one of those mistakes lands squarely upon another person's heart." He gave her a measuring look. "You've heard something, I take it?" "Only what Dolly told me. Mrs. Badcock once met Marina Gregg, abroad, I believe, when she was ill. Measles, she said. She left her bed to meet her idol." Craddock set down his cup. "Yes, that came up in questioning. But what of it?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She gazed into the teapot as though reading shapes in the steam. "Children," she said at last, "are very vulnerable to infection. Measles can be most dangerous, especially to those who have not yet had it. Do you know if Mrs. Gregg ever had children?" The inspector looked surprised. "Adopted, I believe. One died many years ago. You think there's a connection?" "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "that the human heart is not logical, Inspector. It remembers pain with great clarity, and when reminded suddenly it may act before reason can intervene." Craddock leaned forward. "Are you suggesting Mrs. Gregg might have recognized something in Heather Badcock? Something that triggered that expression Mrs. Bantry described? Miss Marple did not look up. Recognition, she murmured, is a powerful thing. Sometimes it breaks a person clean in two. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly against the panes. The inspector sat back, deep in thought, while Miss Marple continued knitting, the quiet rhythm of her needles filling the silence. The case, she knew, was already solved in essence. The rest was merely confirmation. Yet even she did not foresee how swiftly events would reach their grim conclusion. The morning after the fete dawned cold and gray, with a light drizzle washing the petals from the rose bushes in Gossington Hall's gardens. The merriment of the previous afternoon had vanished, replaced by an air of quiet tension that seemed to cling to every hedgerow. A faint mist hung over St. Mary Mead, muffling the sounds of early movement, the baker's cart, the milkman's clinking bottles, the hesitant murmurs outside the post office. In her sitting room at Danemead, Miss Marple sat quite still, a cup of tea cooling beside her. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap. Her mind, though aged and cautious, was sharp and alert as ever. She had been awake most of the night, troubled not by insomnia, but by the persistent whisper of curiosity that had guided her through so many mysteries before. Heather Badcock's sudden death at the fete was being called a tragic seizure, but Miss Marple's instinct, a force she trusted more than any official statement, told her that something far darker lay beneath the surface. She recalled Heather's eager chatter, her almost childlike excitement at meeting Marina Gregg, and that peculiar moment, the way Marina had stood motionless, her expression frozen as if seeing a ghost. Miss Marple's eyes, pale blue and penetrating, turned toward the window. "Poison," she murmured softly. It had the look of poison. But why and how? The doorbell chimed. Cherry, her cheerful but inquisitive housekeeper, appeared moments later, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's Inspector Craddock, ma'am. Says he'd like a word." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Show him in, Cherry. And perhaps bring another cup. Inspector Craddock looks the sort of man who could use tea on a morning like this." When he entered, Craddock's broad frame seemed to fill the small sitting room. His expression, though polite, carried the weary skepticism of a man who had already spent hours sifting through confusion. He greeted her warmly but got straight to the point. "You've heard what happened yesterday, of course." Miss Marple nodded. "Poor Mrs. Badcock, such a talkative, harmless soul. I cannot help feeling there's something unnatural about her death." Craddock gave a slow smile. "Unnatural is one word for it. We've got the coroner's preliminary notes. Poisoning, most likely cyanide. It was in the drink she took from Miss Gregg's tray." Her eyes sharpened. "So it was meant for Marina Gregg, then?" "That's the question," Craddock said, lowering himself into the chair opposite her. Mrs. Badcock reached for the glass first, eager as ever, and drank it. Within a minute she was gone. If she hadn't taken it, we'd likely be investigating the murder of one of the most famous actresses in the country. Miss Marple lifted her cup, her fingers steady. "Or perhaps," she said softly, "we still are." Craddock studied her over the rim of his own cup. "You think the poison was meant for Mrs. Badcock?" "I think," she said, her voice mild but precise, "that appearances are rarely as simple as they seem. Tell me, Inspector, did you notice the expression on Miss Gregg's face when she spoke to the poor woman?" He frowned. "Expression?" "Yes, I was too far to see it myself, but Mrs. Bantry was there. She described it quite vividly. Miss Gregg looked as though she'd seen something dreadful, as though a memory had struck her like a blow." Craddock nodded slowly. Mrs. Bantry said something similar in her statement. "It seems everyone's talking about it." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "There are moments, Inspector, when a person's past catches up to them in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes a face, a word, or a name can bring it all flooding back." He regarded her thoughtfully. "You've got something in mind." "Not yet," she said with a faint smile. "But one never knows where memory will lead." Outside, the rain eased into a light drizzle. Craddock gathered his hat and stood. "Well, Miss Marple, you've helped me before. I wouldn't mind if you kept your ears open on this one. The whole village is buzzing, and you've a knack for hearing what people really mean, not just what they say." "I'll do my best," she said. "And perhaps, Inspector, you might inquire into Mrs. Badcock's past. Sometimes the least remarkable people have the most curious histories." When he left, Miss Marple remained by the window, watching the road until his car disappeared around the corner. Then she rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and began her slow, careful walk toward the village. The air smelled of damp earth and lavender. As she passed the high street, she could feel the tension humming beneath the calm routine. Shopkeepers speaking in hushed tones, women pretending to busy themselves with errands while gossip drifted like smoke. The story had already grown in the telling. Some said Marina Gregg had fainted after the incident. Others claimed she'd screamed. And one young maid from Gossington Hall whispered that she'd seen Marina trembling in her dressing room. Whispering, "It's happened again." Miss Marple tucked that phrase away like a needle in her mind. Again. What had happened before? At the post office, she found Mrs. Bantry engaged in animated conversation with Miss Hartnell. The moment they spotted her, both women straightened. "Jane!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, clearly relieved. "You heard the latest, I suppose?" "It was poison, cyanide. Can you imagine such a thing?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Yes, Inspector Craddock just confirmed it." Miss Hartnell pursed her lips. "Serves those film people right, bringing all that Hollywood nonsense here. Murder and tragedy seem to follow them about." Mrs. Bantry glared at her. "Don't be ridiculous, Lavinia. It's dreadful for them." Poor Marina looked absolutely stricken. Miss Marple listened quietly, then asked, "Tell me, Dolly, when you spoke to Miss Gregg afterward, did she say anything of note?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, thinking. She was shaken, of course. Said she couldn't imagine why anyone would do such a thing. Then she asked to be left alone. "Oh, and Jason Rudd, her husband, was hovering like a hawk. Protective type, that one." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And the staff?" Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "The butler, what's his name? Lakin. He was there the whole time, poor man, looked pale as death. Then there's Ella Zielinski, Marina's secretary. Sharp woman, wears dreadful glasses. She seemed, well, nervous, if you ask me." Miss Marple thanked her friends and went on her way, her mind piecing fragments together like shards of a broken mirror. The words "it's happened again" echoed faintly, overlapping with the image of a frozen expression and a glass raised in innocent enthusiasm. As she returned home, Cherry met her at the gate holding a folded newspaper. "They've printed it already, ma'am. Look, poison at local fete. Film star's guest dies suddenly." Miss Marple took the paper and studied the grainy photograph of Marina Gregg smiling at the camera. Beneath the surface charm there was something in the eyes. A hint of sorrow, perhaps, or fear. She set the paper down carefully. "The past," she whispered, "is a very patient thing. It waits until you least expect it." She turned toward her small writing desk where she kept a stack of neatly labeled notebooks. Opening one, she began to jot down names: Marina Gregg, Jason Rudd, Ella Zielinski, Lakin, Heather Badcock. Then beside Heather's name she wrote 2 words. Why her? The rain began again, gentle and unhurried, tapping softly against the window. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind alive with quiet, relentless curiosity. The rain had stopped by the following morning, leaving behind a gleam on the cobblestones and a faint scent of damp roses around Gossington Hall. Inspector Craddock stood on the gravel drive, coat collar turned up, watching the clouds thin across the pale sky. He had spent most of the night reviewing statements. Every guest, every servant, every idle witness who had hovered near the refreshment table at the fete. Yet, like smoke, the truth seemed to shift each time he thought he had it cornered. The official verdict would eventually read death by poisoning, but Craddock knew the paperwork was the least of his worries. The question was not what had killed Heather Badcock, but who had meant it to. Inside the hall, the house had settled into uneasy silence. The laughter and music of the fete seemed like echoes from another world. Marina Gregg's portrait, one of her film posters, framed grandly on the landing, watched over him as he climbed the stairs. Her face lit by that hauntingly perfect smile that had captivated audiences and, he suspected, hidden more sorrow than anyone guessed. He was shown into the morning room by Lakin, the butler, whose hand still trembled faintly as he adjusted the drapes. "Mrs. Rudd will be with you shortly, sir," the man said, voice carefully even. "Thank you, Lakin," Craddock replied, noting the deep lines of fatigue on the man's face. "You were at the fete the whole time, weren't you?" "Yes, sir." "In charge of the service, though the drinks, those were prepared by Miss Zielinski. Mrs. Rudd's secretary, that is." Craddock's pencil paused. "Ella Zielinski handled the drinks herself?" Lakin nodded. "She poured them. Mrs. Rudd asked her to." I brought the tray out to the lawn myself. Craddock looked up sharply. The same tray from which Mrs. Badcock took her glass? The very one, sir. Lakin's voice faltered, and he swallowed before continuing. It was dreadful, sir. One moment she was laughing, and the next, he trailed off, rubbing his hands together as though to scrub the memory away. Craddock's tone softened. You did right to tell me. That'll be all for now. When Lakin left, Craddock turned toward the tall windows where the weak light fell on the silver tea service. The faint scent of lilies lingered in the room, a detail he might not have noticed except that it reminded him of something Miss Marple had once said. There's always a scent that doesn't belong. People overlook it because it's too gentle to seem important. He smiled faintly. The old lady's voice had a way of staying with him. Moments later, Marina Gregg entered. She moved like someone accustomed to being watched, every gesture deliberate yet strangely fragile. Her dark hair framed her face, and her eyes, gray, wide, restless, betrayed a sleepless night. Inspector, she said quietly, motioning him to sit. Jason is resting, but I told him I'd speak with you myself. Thank you, Mrs. Rudd, Craddock replied. I appreciate your cooperation. She gave a brittle smile. Cooperation is easy enough. It's the rest that isn't. He studied her, not as a fan or a man, but as an investigator reading the layers of expression. There was no doubt that fear lived behind her composure, but it wasn't merely the fear of being a potential victim. It was the fear of memory, the kind that clings to one's reflection and never lets go. Mrs. Rudd, he began, we know the poison was in the drink taken from your tray. From all accounts, Mrs. Badcock reached for it before you could. Had she not, well, we might be having a very different conversation. Marina's eyes flickered. You think it was meant for me? I think that's possible, Craddock said evenly. But I also think someone might have known she'd do exactly that. Reach for the glass first. Like an eager admirer, Marina turned away, gazing toward the garden where the fate tents still stood, sagging with rain. Heather Badcock, she said softly. I remembered her, you know. Not at first. But then when she told me where we'd met before, something came rushing back. Craddock leaned forward. You had met her before? Yes, years ago in Bermuda. I was filming there. Call of the Heart. Dreadful script, but a beautiful place. I was ill at the time, very ill with a fever, and under strict doctor's orders not to see anyone. But she came anyway, barged into my room gushing about how much she admired me, how she simply had to meet me. Her hands clenched together on her lap. And because of that visit, I caught pneumonia. I nearly died. My baby did. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of rain dripping from the eaves. Craddock said nothing. There was no need. She didn't know, of course, Marina continued, her voice low, distant. She was thoughtless, not cruel. But when she stood before me yesterday, smiling, chattering as though nothing had ever happened, I saw it all again. The fever, the coughing, the loss, everything. It was as if... She paused, her gaze hollow. The mirror cracked, right down the middle. Craddock felt a chill, not from the room, but from the strange, dreamlike intensity in her tone. Mrs. Rudd, he said gently. I must ask, you didn't say anything to her? Or touch the glass before she did? Marina blinked as though coming back to herself. No, I didn't. I was just standing there, frozen. She took the drink and then, he nodded. And the glass, do you recall where it came from? Ella brought it, she said, frowning slightly. She poured them out in the kitchen. But anyone might have been there. The guests were in and out all afternoon. It was chaos, Craddock noted that carefully. Thank you, Mrs. Rudd, you've been very helpful. When he left her, he found Ella Zielinski in the hall, adjusting her spectacles with a hand that trembled slightly. She looked like the sort of woman who lived on the edge of exhaustion, efficient, precise, but perpetually nervous. You wanted to see me, Inspector? Yes, Craddock said. Just a few questions about the drinks. She smiled tightly. Of course. Everyone seems very interested in those. He ignored the edge in her tone. You poured them yourself? I did, Mrs. Rudd asked me to. I made a batch of daiquiris, Marina's favorite, and took the tray to Lakin, that's all. Did anyone come into the kitchen while you were working? Her eyes darted away. The caterer, perhaps. One of the maids. I can't remember exactly. Craddock studied her. And the poison, cyanide. It would have been easy enough to introduce if someone had access to the ingredients. Did you use almonds in the drinks? Just a dash of extract for flavor, she said quickly. Standard practice. He nodded slowly, letting silence press on her. Finally, she snapped, If you think I had anything to do with this, you're wasting your time. I adored Marina. I've worked with her for years. Of course, Craddock said mildly. It must be difficult working for someone under such constant pressure. Her mouth tightened. She's a genius, Inspector. But genius always takes its toll. As she turned away, Craddock caught something, a faint smell of almonds clinging to her hands, mingled with cigarette smoke. He watched her retreating figure, thoughtful. Outside, the mist had begun to rise again, softening the garden into something ghostly. Craddock stood for a long moment, the pieces turning slowly in his mind. The motive, the means, the opportunity, all still uncertain. But one thing Miss Marple had once told him seemed to echo in his head. The truth is rarely hidden by complexity, Inspector. It's hidden by habit, by what everyone assumes is ordinary. And as he walked back down the drive toward his car, he began to wonder, what in this perfectly ordinary village fate had seemed just a little too ordinary to notice. The afternoon light slanted thinly across St. Mary Mead as Inspector Craddock's car turned off the main road and rolled to a slow stop outside Dane Mead. The village had settled into that peculiar hush that follows a scandal, quiet enough to hear the flutter of curtains and the murmur of unseen voices behind half-closed doors. He switched off the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the garden gate. He could almost hear Miss Marple's voice already, soft and certain, drawing order out of confusion. When she opened the door herself, wrapped in a pale shawl, her eyes bright despite her age, he felt an odd relief. "Inspector," she said pleasantly, "you look like a man who's been walking in circles." Craddock laughed quietly. "You're not far wrong, Miss Marple. I've been to the hall again. Everyone says the same thing, but nothing quite fits." She led him into the sitting room. The air scented faintly of lavender and tea. "The trouble with people, my dear boy," she said, "is that they tell the truth in such inconvenient fragments." He smiled and took a seat. "You've been thinking, I suppose?" "I have," she said simply, pouring him a cup. "Tell me, what has the coroner decided?" "Cyanide," Craddock said. "In the daiquiri Mrs. Badcock drank. It came from a small bottle, almond extract or so it seemed." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the secretary?" "Ella Zielinski, wasn't it? What do you make of her?" Craddock frowned. Intelligent, nervous, loyal on the surface. But there's something brittle about her, like glass under strain. She poured the drinks herself, but she claims others came and went through the kitchen. Ah. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. The kitchen is the most democratic place in any house. People forget how easily things can be changed there. He watched her carefully. "Do you think she's lying?" "Perhaps not lying," she said, "but omitting. People who live near greatness often do. They forget what they saw or pretend to, because it's easier than believing something dreadful of someone they admire." Craddock leaned back, the chair creaking faintly. "Mrs. Rudd told me she remembered Heather Badcock from years ago. Said that woman once visited her when she was ill, and because of it she lost a child." Miss Marple's eyes lifted, steady and understanding. "Ah yes, the mirror cracked from side to side. I've heard that expression before. It's Tennyson, you know, about the Lady of Shalott. She looked into her mirror and saw the world she could never touch, and when she looked directly instead, her mirror cracked. Poor Marina must have felt something very like that. To see in the flesh the cause of her greatest grief." Craddock stirred uneasily. "So you think she hated Heather?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that hate is sometimes indistinguishable from pain. It festers until it becomes something else entirely." The clock ticked gently between them. Outside, a bird sang once and fell silent. Craddock rubbed his temples. The trouble is, nothing points to Marina actually preparing the poison. And if the drink was meant for her, that doesn't explain why someone else died instead. Miss Marple sipped her tea, thinking. "Tell me, Inspector, has anyone considered that the poison might have been meant for Heather Badcock all along?" He looked up sharply. "You mean she was the intended victim?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said, her tone mild but certain. "If one thinks of the psychology of murder, not just the mechanics. The act was personal, quick, direct, and delivered in a moment of intimacy. Marina stood before her frozen, perhaps not from fear but from realization. Suppose someone knew about that old story. The illness, the lost child. and believed Heather's thoughtless act had ruined Marina's life. That person might decide to take justice into their own hands. Craddock frowned. You mean Jason Rudd? She shook her head slowly. No, not necessarily. Husbands can be protective, yes, but I don't see in him the kind of rage that kills. He's the sort who controls things, arranges, defends, manages. But murder born of emotion rarely comes from control. It comes from obsession, he considered that. Ella Zielinski? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, the secretary. Always near, always watching. Admiration curdled into something darker, perhaps. And she might think she was doing Marina a favor. Craddock took a slow breath. There's another thing. Ella's hands smelled faintly of almonds when I spoke to her. Miss Marple's knitting stopped. That's rather significant, isn't it? Yes, but it could be nothing, he admitted. She might simply have handled the extract. Indeed. Or she might have handled something else. Something meant to disguise a more sinister scent. But let us not leap too far. What about the glass? Was it examined? Thoroughly. No fingerprints other than Mrs. Badcock's and Ella's, nothing on the rim. Nothing, Miss Marple repeated softly. That's often the most telling clue of all. Craddock looked puzzled. How do you mean? When something dreadful happens, she said, people think they must look for what's added. The poison, the weapon, the stranger. But sometimes it's what has been wiped away that tells the truth. Someone took care to erase their trace, he smiled faintly. You make it sound so simple. It usually is, she said. Human folly rarely needs complex machinery, only opportunity. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Craddock rose, setting his cup aside. I'll look into Ella's movements more closely, and I'll have another word with the servants. Perhaps one of them noticed something they thought too small to mention. Do, Miss Marple said, standing with him. And, Inspector, there's one more thing. If you have the chance, ask Mrs. Rudd about her films. Not just the recent ones, but those made around the time she lost her child. The past leaves fingerprints on the present in the most unexpected ways. He nodded, knowing better than to dismiss her cryptic advice. I'll do that. When he left, the garden outside Dane Mead had turned gold in the late sun, but Miss Marple did not watch him go. She sat again in her chair, knitting untouched, her thoughts circling like quiet doves around a single point. A mirror, a woman's face, and a word spoken long ago, again. Somewhere in that word lay the truth. The next morning broke under a veil of silver mist, the kind that clung low over the hedgerows and softened the outlines of roofs and trees until the whole of St. Mary Mead seemed half asleep, waiting. Inspector Craddock was already awake, standing before the window of his small hotel room, a cigarette smoldering forgotten between his fingers. The events of the last few days had woven themselves into a puzzle that refused to loosen its grip on his mind. Every piece he added only seemed to make the picture more complex, not less. He dressed quickly, and by the time the clock struck 9, he was back at Gossington Hall. The great house loomed through the fog, a silhouette of stone and shadow. The sound of his shoes on the gravel seemed too loud in the quiet. When the door opened, it was Jason Rudd himself who greeted him, a faintly courteous gesture that made Craddock immediately wary. The man was immaculate, but his eyes were tired, hollowed slightly by sleepless nights. Inspector, Rudd said, his voice controlled as ever. You've come early. I thought it best, Craddock replied evenly. Perhaps we might have a word before Mrs. Rudd joins us. For a moment Rudd hesitated, then stepped aside and gestured him in. Very well. The library. They walked down the corridor, the air faintly scented with wax and paper and something else, chemical perhaps, from the film reels that still occupied a corner of the room. Craddock took a seat, notebook unopened. Mr. Rudd, he began, I'd like to talk again about your wife's movements during the fete. Small details perhaps. Sometimes they make all the difference. Jason gave a small, weary smile. You police always say that, and I suppose you're right. He poured himself coffee but did not drink it. What do you want to know? She went out to the garden after speaking to a few of the villagers. Was anyone with her at the time? Rudd shook his head. No, she was in her element, as always, smiling, gracious. People came and went. She doesn't need company. She carries her own light with her. His tone was affectionate, but there was something in it too. Resentment? Fatigue? Craddock wasn't sure. And after the commotion, when Mrs. Badcock collapsed, what did she do? She froze, Rudd said quietly. I've never seen anything like it. She just stood there. For a moment I thought she'd faint too. Then she whispered something, again I think it was, and went inside. I followed, of course. She was shaking. I gave her a sedative. She slept for hours. Craddock leaned forward slightly. Did she explain what she meant by that word? Jason's eyes flickered. No, but I think I know. He set his cup down with a faint click. Years ago, before we were married, Marina went through something terrible. It changed her. She told me bits and pieces, enough to know she lost a child and that there was a woman involved. Someone thoughtless, careless. Heather Badcock was that woman, wasn't she? Craddock said nothing, letting silence do the work. Jason exhaled. I thought so. She told me the story once, not the name. But when Heather introduced herself that day, when she said she'd gone to see Marina years ago while she was sick, I saw my wife's face. It was like watching a mask crack. He rose and walked toward the window. You think she did it, don't you? I think, Craddock said slowly, that something inside her broke that day. Whether it led to murder, that's another matter. Jason turned, his expression unreadable. If you're asking whether she's capable of it, yes. She's capable of anything when she feels cornered. But you'll never prove it. I've spent half my life protecting her from herself. The words hung in the air, quiet and damning. A soft sound made them both turn. In the doorway stood Marina Gregg, wrapped in a pale blue robe, her hair unbound, her face almost ethereal in the morning light. Protecting me from myself, Jason? She said gently. How gallant. Jason stiffened, color rising faintly in his cheeks. Marina, you shouldn't be up. Nonsense, she interrupted, crossing the room with the slow grace of a cat. I'm quite well. Inspector, I thought you'd have given up questioning by now. Craddock inclined his head. I'm afraid not, Mrs. Rudd. There are still things I don't understand. Are there ever not? She said lightly, seating herself near the fire. Go on then, ask. He studied her for a moment. The woman before him was dazzling even in disarray, but her eyes, those famous luminous eyes, were tired. Behind the poise there was something fractured. Mrs. Rudd, he said, you remember saying the word again at the fete. Do you recall what you meant by it? She smiled faintly, almost sadly. Do I? Oh, Inspector. Some memories come back to you whether you want them or not. When Heather Badcock spoke to me that day, I remembered the last time I saw her. So eager, so proud of herself. She'd come to see me while I was ill with German measles, you know. She said she simply had to meet me, though she was a little unwell. I smiled, of course. One always smiles. And then later, her voice faltered. Later, my baby was born dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. So you see, she said softly. When she stood there smiling at me again after all those years, I saw her face and I thought again. The past had come back full circle, and then she fell. Craddock watched her closely. There was no tremor in her voice, no flicker of guilt, only exhaustion. But whether that exhaustion was from grief or deceit, he could not tell. Jason stepped forward. You've had enough, Marina. Go upstairs, she turned to him, something sharp in her gaze. Always the director, aren't you, Jason? Then without another word, she rose and left the room. The faint scent of her perfume lingering behind like the echo of a dream. Craddock waited until she was gone, then said quietly, You love her very much. Jason's jaw tightened. Love her? Yes. But love isn't always enough to save someone from what they are. He turned away, and for the first time, Craddock saw a flicker of something almost like fear in the man's face. That afternoon, Craddock made his way back to Mead. Miss Marple was in the garden, trimming roses, her straw hat tipped slightly to one side. She looked up as he approached, a faint smile playing on her lips. You've been to see them again, I take it? I have, he said. And I've heard quite a story. She admits the connection now, the illness, the child. But she denies any involvement in the poisoning. Miss Marple nodded as if she'd expected nothing else. Naturally. The guilty rarely confess outright. They convince themselves that what they've done was something else entirely. An accident, an act of justice, a moment of weakness. Craddock sighed. The problem is the evidence doesn't pin it on her. There's nothing tangible. Only words and shadows. Miss Marple's shears clicked neatly through another stem. Shadows can be very revealing, Inspector. You mustn't underestimate them. He gave a small laugh. You always make it sound as though I'm looking in the wrong direction. Not wrong, she said, merely too straight. You see, truth rarely sits directly in front of us. It lingers at the edges, waiting for us to turn our heads just slightly. He frowned. You think someone else did it? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that someone believed they were saving Mrs. Rudd from her own despair. Someone who adored her, who saw her pain and thought they understood what she needed. That kind of devotion can be very dangerous. Craddock's mind leapt instantly to Ella Zielinski. The secretary again. Miss Marple's smile deepened, approving. She lived in Mrs. Rudd's shadow for years. That sort of proximity breeds not only admiration but possession. Did you know she suffers from migraines? Yes, Craddock said slowly. She uses smelling salts sometimes. Ah, said Miss Marple, eyes bright. And what do those salts smell of? Almonds, Craddock whispered. The old woman nodded. Indeed. How convenient that the smell of cyanide could be so easily mistaken. Craddock stared at her, realization dawning. You think she planned it? Poisoned Heather on purpose, believing she was helping Marina rid herself of a painful memory? Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly. Or perhaps she thought she was protecting her from scandal, from breakdown, from the sight of that woman who had caused so much pain. Love can twist itself into strange shapes, Inspector. The church bell tolled the hour somewhere in the misty distance, and Craddock rose. I'll bring her in tonight, he said. You've given me more than enough. Miss Marple looked up at him, serene as ever. Be gentle with her if you can. She's not evil, just misguided. The world is full of such people. He nodded, then hesitated. And if it wasn't her? Miss Marple's eyes softened. Then you'll find the truth soon enough. Mirrors always show what's real in the end, no matter how much one wishes they wouldn't. As he walked away down the path, the mist began to lift, sunlight breaking through in thin, golden threads. Behind him, Miss Marple's scissors snipped delicately among the roses, one final bloom falling to the earth with a soft sigh, like the quiet end of an old, tragic story still waiting for its final word. Night fell like a quiet shroud over St. Mary Mead, a blue-gray stillness that crept into the hedgerows and settled along the cobbled lanes. At Gossington Hall, only a few windows glowed faintly, one upstairs, another in the long drawing room where Jason Rudd stood before the hearth, a decanter in hand but no glass beside it. The fire was nearly out, flickering in restless orange sighs, casting his face into a kind of sculpted weariness. He had not spoken to Marina since the afternoon. She had locked her door as she sometimes did when the ghosts grew too loud. In the silence, he thought he heard her voice once, low, broken, as if she were speaking to someone unseen. But when he went to listen, there was nothing, only the echo of his own footsteps and the distant ticking of a clock somewhere deep within the house. When the bell rang, sharp, unexpected, it startled him enough to spill a few drops of sherry on the rug. He went to the door himself, the sound of the latch echoing faintly. Inspector Craddock stood there, his expression grave, and beside him, small and deliberate as ever, was Miss Marple. Good evening, the old lady said softly. Forgive us for the intrusion at this hour. It couldn't wait. Jason hesitated. Has something happened? Craddock's voice was calm but clipped. We'd like to speak to Miss Zielinski. Is she still here? Jason frowned. Ella, I believe so. She was packing earlier, said she needed a few days away. What is this about? Miss Marple stepped forward slightly, her eyes steady on him. It's about kindness, Mr. Rudd. Misguided kindness, I'm afraid. Before he could respond, a door opened at the end of the hall. Ella Zielinski appeared, a small suitcase in hand. Her face was pale, her hair loose from its usual tidy coil. The faint smell of almonds, sharp, sweet, unmistakable, drifted into the hall as she came closer. Inspector, she said quietly. I rather thought you'd come. Craddock nodded once. I think you did too, Miss Zielinski. Jason looked from one to the other, confusion tightening his voice. What's going on here? Ella set the suitcase down, her hands trembling slightly. It doesn't matter, Jason, it was all my fault. I thought I truly believed I was helping her. Helping? He repeated, stunned. She turned to Craddock, her words tumbling now, broken by emotion she'd held too long. You have to understand. Marina's been living with that pain for years. I've seen it. The nights she'd wake screaming, the way she'd stare at herself in the mirror as if she hated what she saw. And then that woman appeared.
Heather Badcock.
Laughing, talking about that day as though it were something charming. She never knew what she'd done. Her voice cracked. I couldn't bear it. I thought if I could get rid of her quietly, then maybe Marina could finally sleep again. Jason's face drained of color. You poisoned her? Ella's hands went to her temples. I didn't mean for her to suffer. It was only a small dose, just enough to make her ill, to make her go away. I poured it into the glass. Marina's glass, I thought, but Heather picked it up first. And when she fell, I realized what I'd done. Craddock's expression was unreadable. The poison was in Marina's glass? Yes, Ella whispered. I thought if she'd never touched it, no one would ever know. But then she stopped, trembling. Then Marina looked at me. She knew. She knew instantly what I'd done. She hasn't said a word since, but she knows. Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost pitying. And she's been protecting you ever since, hasn't she, my dear? Ella nodded miserably. She told me to leave it. That nothing could bring the past back. That I'd done enough damage. But I saw her face when she said it. It wasn't anger. It was pity. For me. Jason sank into a chair, staring at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. You killed that woman for Marina? She was everything, Ella said, tears sliding down her face. You think you loved her, Jason, but you didn't know what it was like. To be near her, to breathe the same air, to know you'd never mean as much as a memory. She lived behind glass. I just wanted to free her. Miss Marple moved closer, her presence calm, steady as a hand upon a fevered brow. My dear, she said softly, love is a strange thing. It blinds as often as it heals. You thought you were saving her, but you only gave her another wound to carry. Craddock spoke gently. Miss Zielinski, I'll have to take you in. You understand that? Ella nodded, almost relieved. Yes, it's over now. She turned to Jason. Take care of her. She'll need you. She always needed someone. She picked up her suitcase, then paused, glancing toward the staircase. She's listening, you know. She's always listening. And indeed, as Craddock followed her out, they all heard it. The faint creak of a floorboard above, a door closing quietly, like a curtain drawn at the end of a scene. When they were gone, Jason remained sitting, motionless. Miss Marple watched him for a long moment before speaking. You mustn't hate her, she said. She did a terrible thing, yes, but out of love. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. Sometimes that's the most anyone can ask. Jason rose slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. What will happen to Marina? Miss Marple sighed. She'll live with it. That's her punishment, to look into her mirror each morning and see all the ghosts she's gathered there. He said nothing more, and when Miss Marple left him, the fire had burned to ash, leaving only a faint, bitter smell in the air, almonds again, or memory. By the following morning, word had spread quietly through St. Mary Mead. There was no shouting, no spectacle, only a soft murmur of dismay that rippled through the village lanes. At the shop, Mrs. Hartnell declared that she had always suspected something peculiar about that secretary. At the vicarage, Mrs. Dane Calthrop merely sighed and said it was sad for everyone concerned. And Miss Marple, sitting once more in her garden with her knitting, listened to the wind and thought of how very fragile people were, how easily love turned to guilt, and guilt to silence. She was not surprised when Craddock stopped by later that day. He stood by the gate, hat in hand, looking as though the weight of the whole affair had settled on his shoulders. She confessed in full. He said quietly, everything matches the evidence. Marina won't be charged. There's no proof she knew in advance. But she's not well. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I imagine not. She won't act again, Craddock continued. Jason says she can't bear cameras anymore. Says every lens feels like a mirror now. Poor soul, Miss Marple murmured. She's been living behind one all her life. Craddock hesitated. There's one thing I don't understand. When you told me to look for what had been wiped away, you meant the fingerprints. Miss Marple smiled faintly, partly, but I also meant the truth. People spend their lives trying to wipe away the bits of truth they can't bear to see, yet it always shows through again, just like a crack beneath fresh paint. He looked at her with a kind of weary admiration. You always make it sound so simple. It is simple, she said softly. Terrible things often are, he thanked her, then turned to go. But before he reached the gate, she called after him. Inspector, do you remember what Tennyson wrote? The mirror cracked from side to side. The curse has come upon me, cried the Lady of Shalott. Poor Marina. The curse was never madness, you see. It was remembrance. The wind stirred the roses, carrying their faint perfume through the garden. Craddock touched his hat and walked away, his figure fading into the sunlight. Miss Marple sat for a long while after, her knitting idle in her lap. In the stillness, she thought of Marina Gregg's eyes, beautiful, haunted, forever reflecting something she could not escape. And for a brief moment, the old lady closed her own eyes and whispered, "Rest, my dear." Rest at last. Then she picked up her needles again, the soft clicking of the yarn blending with the distant tolling of the church bell, a small, steady sound, marking the end of one tragedy and the quiet continuation of life in the village that always endured. The days that followed passed quietly, as if the whole village had drawn a collective breath and was too afraid to exhale. St. Mary Mead resumed its routines, the post arriving on time, the milk bottles clinking at dawn. But beneath the surface, conversation flowed like an underground current. Names were whispered, glances exchanged, and yet the truth, already known, had settled into that curious state peculiar to English villages. Everyone knew, and no one said a word. Miss Marple, of course, did not gossip. She sat in her garden, knitting needles flashing in the soft light, a small plate of shortbread within easy reach. The autumn air had sharpened slightly, bringing with it the scent of fallen apples and smoke. She had not gone to see Marina Gregg since the confession. There were things that time must be allowed to settle, things that human kindness could not rush. But Marina, it seemed, had not found peace. Jason Rudd visited Miss Marple one late afternoon. He looked older, she thought, not in years, but in spirit. His movements were slower, his voice subdued. The vitality that had once animated him, the director's quick mind and restless energy, had dimmed. "I don't know why I came," he admitted when she had poured him tea. "Perhaps because I thought you might understand." "Perhaps I might," Miss Marple said gently. "How is she?" He sighed. "Different. Quieter. At first I thought it was shock or exhaustion. But now—" He hesitated. "She doesn't speak much. Some days she doesn't leave her room. The mirrors are all covered, every one of them. She says they watch her. She says they show her what she's lost." Miss Marple's hands paused on the teapot. "Ah," she murmured, "the mirror again." Jason leaned forward, his voice low. "She doesn't blame Ella. Isn't that strange? She says it was fate, that everything comes full circle in the end. But she can't look at herself anymore. It's as if she sees someone else staring back." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "Guilt takes many forms, Mr. Rudd. Sometimes we bear it for what we've done, sometimes for what we failed to prevent. In her case, it may be both." He rubbed his face wearily. "I've tried to reach her, but it's like speaking to a reflection. Words go in, but they don't come back." She gave a small nod. "There are wounds that can't be mended by comfort, only by forgiveness. But that's the hardest gift to give oneself." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Do you think she'll ever recover?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "She will live, that much I'm sure of. But recovery is another thing entirely. When a mirror cracks, you can fit the pieces back together, but the image will never be whole again." Jason was silent for a while, staring into his untouched tea. "I'm taking her away," he said finally. "Somewhere quiet. Switzerland, perhaps. She hates the cold, but she likes the silence. Maybe there she can start over." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "A wise choice. Sometimes it helps to step away from the scene of the sorrow." He managed a faint smile. "You always speak as if life were a play." She chuckled softly. "And isn't it, in its way? We all have our entrances and exits. The trick is to know when to step back before the curtain falls." He stood, hat in hand. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You've been more help than you know." After he left, she sat a long time in silence. The light faded gradually, and the church bell marked the hour with a deep, melancholy tone. Somewhere far away, a train's whistle sounded, perhaps the one that would soon carry Marina Gregg away from St. Mary Mead, from her past, from herself. At Gossington Hall, the once bustling house had grown eerily still. The servants spoke in whispers, moving softly through corridors that echoed faintly with memories. Marina had not appeared downstairs for 3 days. When she finally did, it was early morning and only Jason was awake to see her. She wore a plain gray dress, her hair loose about her shoulders. She looked years older, the glamour stripped away, revealing something fragile and almost childlike beneath. She walked to the window, opened it, and let the cold air sweep in. "It smells different," she said quietly. "Do you notice? As if the world has changed since that day." Jason hesitated. "Perhaps it has." She turned to him, her eyes unfocused, like someone seeing something that wasn't there. "I keep hearing her voice, Heather's. She wasn't malicious, you know, just thoughtless. People do terrible things out of thoughtlessness." He came closer, placing a tentative hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to think about it anymore. It's over." She shook her head slowly. "Nothing is ever really over, Jason. It just goes quiet. That's worse sometimes." He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that time would dull the pain, but the words felt false. Instead, he simply held her as the morning light crept across the floorboards, turning her pale face almost translucent. By the end of the week, they had gone. The villagers watched the car drive away down the long lane, the chauffeur's cap glinting faintly through the trees. Miss Hartnell at her gate remarked that it was a mercy, really, for all concerned. Mrs. Price Ridley disagreed. She said tragedy always followed the glamorous and it was better to keep such people elsewhere. Only Miss Marple, standing at her garden gate with a shawl around her shoulders, said nothing. She watched until the sound of the car faded, then turned back to her roses. There was comfort in small, steady things, in petals opening to light, in the familiar hum of bees, in the rhythm of the ordinary world that endured long after the extraordinary had burned itself out. Still, as she trimmed a wayward branch, she found herself thinking of Marina's face, the haunted reflection behind the beauty, and of Heather Badcock's bright, oblivious smile, the smile of a woman who meant no harm and yet had set a tragedy in motion simply by being thoughtless enough to share a story. Life, Miss Marple thought, was very rarely about villains or heroes. It was about mistakes, small, human, devastating mistakes. She went inside, made her tea, and opened her notebook. On its first page, written in neat, delicate handwriting, were a few lines from Tennyson. She had written them long ago, after another case, but tonight they seemed truer than ever. The mirror cracked from side to side. "The curse has come upon me," cried the Lady of Shalott. She closed the book gently. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the window pane with a sound almost like a sigh. Weeks later, a letter arrived at Mead. The envelope was thick, the handwriting elegant but uneven. Miss Marple opened it carefully. It was from Jason Rudd. He wrote from a small villa near Lake Lucerne. Marina was quieter now. She painted sometimes, he said. Mostly landscapes. She never painted people anymore. "The mirrors are gone," the letter said, "but every window here reflects the lake, and sometimes she stands by them for hours. I think she's learning to look again, not at herself, but at the world." Miss Marple smiled faintly as she folded the letter. "A small beginning," she murmured. When the evening came, she lit her lamp and sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, the fire crackling softly nearby. The village was peaceful, and for a moment she allowed herself to rest in that peace. The mirror had cracked, yes, but even broken glass could still catch the light, and in that fragile shimmer there was a kind of beauty. The gray of dawn crept softly over St. Mary Mead, washing the world in that hesitant light before the day truly begins. The mist lay low along the hedgerows, and somewhere in the distance a milk lorry rattled faintly, the only sign that life went on beyond the weight of what had been uncovered. Inspector Craddock's car rolled into the narrow lane toward Gossington Hall, its tires whispering on damp gravel. He had barely slept. In the back of his mind lingered Miss Marple's voice from the night before, calm, sorrowful, almost forgiving. "When you look into a mirror and see something you cannot bear, sometimes it is not hatred you feel, but grief too deep for words." Marina Gregg had confessed. Not in the usual sense, not to the law or even to Craddock himself, but to something higher, her own conscience. And that, Miss Marple had said quietly, was where true justice sometimes began. When he reached the hall, Jason Rudd was waiting at the door. His face was pale, lined with exhaustion, but his tone was steady. "She's awake," he said simply, "but she won't see a doctor. She says she's had enough of explanations." Craddock nodded. "May I?" Jason hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. "Go gently, she's fragile this morning." The drawing room was cold, though a fire had been lit. Marina sat near it, still in her dressing gown, her hands clasped around a cup of untouched tea. The morning light made her skin seem translucent, as if she were fading even as she sat there. Craddock took a seat opposite her. "Mrs. Rudd," he began quietly, "I'd like you to tell me in your own words what happened that day at the fete." Her lips trembled, but she didn't look away. "You already know," she said softly, "but I'll say it if only to hear it myself." The room was utterly still. Only the faint tick of the mantel clock filled the silence. "I saw her," Marina began. "Heather Badcock." That name meant nothing to anyone else. Just a silly, excited woman. But to me, she was the ghost of something I had buried long ago. When she pushed through the crowd, talking, smiling, telling me she had once come to see me while she was ill, I knew. Oh, I knew immediately who she was. I could still see her face as it had been, flushed with fever, and remember how I had held her hand, thinking her devotion touching. 2 days later, I was burning with the same fever, and the doctors said it would be all right. It wasn't. Her voice broke, and she drew a long, trembling breath. The baby was born too soon. They told me not to blame anyone. But you can't help where grief settles, Inspector. It finds its mark, and it stays there like a shard of glass in the heart. Craddock said nothing. He had heard confessions before, but never like this, and so quiet, so devoid of defense or drama. "I didn't plan it," she continued. "Not in the way people think. I simply remembered. When I saw her so pleased with herself, so unaware, it all came back. I told Ella to fetch drinks. Daiquiris, my favorite. But when she brought them, I asked her to set them down for a moment. I took the little vial from my bag. I had been keeping it for weeks for myself, you see. There are times when one wants control over how things end." Her eyes lifted to his, clear, unwavering. I poured a few drops into one of the glasses. I meant to drink it myself later after the crowds had gone. But Heather reached for it first. I can still see her hand, so quick, so sure, and then her face smiling, grateful, foolishly happy. A tremor passed through her, but her voice stayed even. When she drank, I realized what I'd done. I tried to stop her, but it was too late. And then I froze. Not from fear, but from recognition. The mirror had cracked, Inspector. The reflection I'd been living with all these years broke apart, and I saw myself as I truly was. A murderer not by plan, but by heart. Jason moved from the doorway to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She didn't look at him. "I would have told you sooner," she whispered. But Jason begged me to wait. He thought perhaps the world didn't need to know. But the world always knows in the end. "Doesn't it, Inspector?" Craddock nodded slowly. "It does, Mrs. Rudd, one way or another." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Marina set her cup aside and looked toward the window, where the mist was beginning to lift from the garden. "You'll do what you must," she said quietly. "I only ask one thing. Don't let them say I hated her. I didn't, not truly. I pitied her. She was foolish, but she meant no harm. She just didn't understand that her kindness could destroy something fragile." Craddock rose, his voice low. "I'll make sure that's understood." As he turned to leave, she added almost dreamily, "You know, Inspector, when the mirror cracked, it wasn't the glass that hurt me. It was what I saw behind it." He paused, meeting her gaze for a heartbeat longer before stepping away. Outside, the air was cold and sharp. Jason followed him onto the terrace, lighting a cigarette with unsteady fingers. "She'll face it," he said softly. "Whatever comes." I think in a strange way she's relieved. Craddock studied him. "And you?" Jason's eyes clouded. "I loved her once because she was untouchable, a goddess. But gods are lonely, Inspector. You can't save them. You can only stand beside them when they fall." He dropped the cigarette, crushed it beneath his heel, and turned back toward the house. Craddock watched him go, then walked slowly down the drive. Somewhere far behind him, a door closed, and the echo lingered like a sigh through the mist.